Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's program, The Business Community's Role in Championing Racial Justice. This panel is part of PBI's Fighting for Justice series. I am Eve Runyon, President and CEO of Pro Bono Institute. Today, we are delighted to present this panel discussion highlighting perspectives of C-suite executives and corporate board members. This program continues important conversations PBI has hosted on how we can more effectively support diverse communities and promote equity and inclusion. Thank you to our generous sponsors who have made PBI's Fighting for Justice series a reality. We will start today's program with a moderated discussion among the panelists. Then we will open the discussion for Q&A with attendees. We invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A icon that is at the bottom of your screen. We will prompt you when the Q&A portion of the program begins. Our panelists are fantastic corporate leaders who are eager to share their perspectives with you. So it is my pleasure to welcome David Williams. He is a principal at Deloitte and a PBI board member to moderate today's conversation. Thank you for joining us. Now let's begin the discussion. David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Eve, thank you very much, and I welcome everybody to this conversation on the business community's role in championing racial justice. It has been a very, very interesting 7 months as far as this topic has been concerned, and the business community has been a significant player in the environment that we're all in and the conversations that we've all been having. What I'd love to do right now with our panel is have a conversation that is both introspective, and that is what has the business community done and how effective it's been, and prospective. That is, what is it that we can expect the business community to do going forward, and hopefully how successful that will be. I'd like to start with a conversation with Terry McClure. You see Terry's background listed there. And Terry, we have seen an active participation by the business community in racial justice subjects essentially since March, and in the March, April, and May timeframe. How effective do you think that's been? And are you surprised by the fact that the community has been so involved given history?
Hi, David. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this topic. I think it's an extraordinary topic and certainly timely. And thanks, Eve, for hosting this event. Great question. I do think that we're seeing unprecedented discussions and focus on racial justice and equality in the boardrooms and in the executive suites of many companies right now. And I do think it seems like it's a little different than some of the patterns that we've had in the past. I think the last time I remember seeing this much interest, it was really around the large race discrimination class actions, the wave of class actions that hit in the 80s, where companies began to really focus on discrimination issues. But this certainly seems to be a little bit more broader than that. It really is about what's happening within the businesses as well as what's going on in the community and in our society in general. So I do think that the discussion is unprecedented in sort of its focus. My hope is that the impact and the outcome of the discussion will be unprecedented, but that's yet to be seen. But I do think that there are more people talking about it and focusing on it and developing committees and initiatives within their organizations to see what impact they can make. And I'm hopeful that it will result in change.
Terry, thanks for that. I'd now like to ask Clarence Otis to join the conversation. Clarence, you're the former chairman and CEO of Darden Restaurant, a corporate board member out in the community right now. You and I have had this conversation on numerous occasions about the things that sort of rise to the level of being important to a CEO or to a chair in the context of conversations like these. Tell me why you think this issue became that during the time that it has.
I think, David, you and I have had a lot of conversations about exactly that. The sort of what is the priorities of an organization? What's that small group of things? Because in most organizations, sort of running the business on a day-to-day basis takes up so much organizational energy that you don't have a lot of room for additional things to focus on. And so when you look at those additional things, whether they're transformation of various components of the business or this kind of topic, it's a pretty small list. And to the extent that this topic, sort of inclusion, diversity, is one of those, it's only one of those if the CEO is saying that it is. I mean, you can say it and then walk away from it, but it's the kind of thing like your other core initiatives that you have to repeat over and over and over again and get to the point where your team has to repeat it over and over and over again. And that way it becomes one of those handful of organizational priorities. And I think as Terry mentioned, this topic really became a priority from a defensive perspective in the 80s, as people really responded to those mass class action discrimination suits that occurred in a lot of places, Coca-Cola, Texaco. And as a consequence of that, I think people felt like they wanted to begin to play offense and not be on a defensive footing. And so they really did focus on diversity and representation. And to some extent, the corporate sector really lagged much of higher education by about a decade. Higher education had been focused on representation. Many schools saw some very, very strong progress. And so we focused on representation, but not so much on inclusion. It was more about getting the numbers, expecting that these diverse people, diverse backgrounds, diverse perspectives would come in and fit in. But that has not been the case. And I think the George Floyd episode, which opened the conversation about race in America generally, made it pretty clear that that was not the case, and that African Americans were bearing undue burden trying to fit in, and in doing so, really leaving their whole selves outside the workplace. And so now we're at a moment where inclusion is added to that conversation, which is important, but also where Black people are the focus of the conversation once again. The other thing that had happened was diversity had gotten to mean a lot of different things, a lot of different groups, and important that it did that, but it came at the expense of a focus on race. And I think in part because race is tougher and a more difficult issue to talk about than some of the other dimensions of diversity.
Clarence, thanks for that. I'd also like to bring Bret Hart from American Airlines in to the conversation. Bret, can you hear us?
Yes.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine, Bret.
Okay. Is my video, I'm not getting video on this end. Is it up?
I'm not sure you are, but you can hear us and we can see that it's you. So we'll believe, oh, there you are. There you are.
I think everything blacked out when you said I was from American Airlines. My people probably intervened and shut that down.
Bret, let's be very careful about that in a consumer-run business now. Bret, you and I have kicked around the idea that we've seen lots of activity from corporates, and we've seen various types of statements made. Some, quite frankly, more effective than others. Some ring true, others seem not to. Does this get to Clarence's notion of offense versus defense, or do you have a different view on why we're seeing sort of different participation at different levels?
No, I think Terry and Clarence have been spot on. I think that we're in a space where all of the statements that are being made by corporations are appropriate, and they're at different levels of effectiveness, and it's what's expected. However, we're also in a space where, given all of the different parties who are pushing, from the board to employees to the community, corporations have license now that maybe they didn't feel that they had before to actually do something more than step forward with the statements that we're accustomed to seeing whenever there is a development like this. The intensity around it this time, I think, gives every company the opportunity to do more than just issue the statements that we're accustomed to seeing. So I think, as Terry alluded to, we're now moving into an area where we'll start to see whether or not corporations are going to follow through and do more than simply put out statements that everyone finds encouraging, but that at the end of the day are just really the starting point.
So what does the corporation own in this conversation that the regular citizen or the not-for-profit or the government agency doesn't have access to? What is it that's unique about a corporate entity in this context that makes their participation most particularly valuable? Terry, I don't know if you have any thought there.
I think it really is, it's the influence. I mean, quite frankly, corporations and CEOs, particularly large corporations, have a significant influence, both on their constituents, their customers, their employees. They even can have influence on the government. I mean, many times the corporation takes steps before government actually acts, and before there's legislation or regulations. So I do think that there is a voice. The big business and even small businesses have a voice, and I think it's important. My experience has been sometimes corporations are hesitant to weigh in on any side of an issue because they are concerned about the fact that they do have a diverse customer base and they don't want to offend any customers. But I think what's a little bit different here is there seems to be a little bit clearer picture of what's right and wrong here. The George Floyd knee was just a visual representation that I don't think anyone could ignore, that it was wrong. And so it made it a little easier for corporations to be able to weigh in, and the expectation was absolutely there from employees, from customers, that business weigh in on this issue. So I do think that business has a little bit more freedom. They don't have to worry about the votes of constituents. They do have to worry about the votes of their consumers. But I do think where the issues are a little bit clearer on right and wrong now, that's easy to speak on. The question is, as Bret talked about, what's the answer and how do you fix it? And that's the harder problem. And I think that's where corporations are really struggling with what's the response to the clear wrong that they're seeing.
And so the idea of talking, of taking the bully pulpit, if you will, and pointing out what they see and pointing towards truth is easy. The fix is what becomes a tad more dicey. Is that your view, Bret, as well?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think if you think about the broader point that Terry's making, our companies are already plugged into all of the areas that they really need to be plugged into to have an influence in this area. You think about our connections to the community where our employees live. And you think about our connections to the government. You think about our ability to put together effective communication campaigns. The apparatus is already there, and we use it day in and day out to tackle the most difficult issues that our companies face. When there is something that's critically important to our strategic objectives, we're able to marshal our resources and marshal our communication teams and our government affairs teams and the work that we do in the community to get those things done. We can do the same thing in this area. It is a matter of the extent to which companies are going to be willing to expend that capital and to step outside of their comfort zone, as Clarence was talking about.
And I also think that there's a reticence, or at least I sense a reticence, because having this conversation makes the corporate entity itself vulnerable. Because it's got to look at what it's been doing and what's happening in its own house. Clarence, running a large organization, is that something top of mind?
I think that's actually the first place to really begin the journey. I think companies have an obligation to really look at themselves. And so we're talking about racial inequity across the society and in different aspects of society. And so the initial conversation really has to be, where are we as a company? What disparities do we have? And why do those disparities exist? And some of them exist for larger social reasons. I mean, you can go back and think about the history in this country, and you think about all of the massive wealth building programs that have existed over time, all the way from the 19th century sort of land grants through the subsidized home loans for veterans, GI Bill subsidizing veterans' education, on and on. And Black people were excluded from those. That explains the larger disparities. But the disparities in our organizations don't just reflect that, they also reflect what we did as organizations. And so there were times when we did not hire Black people. If we did, we hired them for certain positions, they were stuck in those positions, and we did not elevate them. So we need to take a look at ourselves as a company and saying, these disparities that exist at the company are not just because of larger dynamics, but they're also because of the dynamics in this organization. You know, we have employee units that belong to the different trades, and those trades excluded Black people, and we were complicit in that exclusion. And so building that sort of racial literacy, if you will, is part of the conversation that puts you in a place to talk to your larger employee base about why it's necessary for us to do something now about it. It's not just about being a good corporate citizen, it's about being a good organization, better than we've been.
And so that brings us to, at least for a couple of people who have reached out to me, a dicey part of the conversation, and I apologize in advance for this, but I think we need to deal with it in order to get to where we need to get to, and that is, and I'll just use an example. In May, I got a call from a good friend in the corporate world whose company had made what has been heralded as perhaps one of the most strong, most forceful, most influential statements about what's been going on about racial justice. And she said to me, well, that's about as surprising as I could have ever expected anything to be from my company, given they haven't done a thing about things inside of our company for as long as I've been with them. Does that statement sort of ring true with you? Have you guys heard the same thing? How do you react to that? Bret, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that's part of the personal experience, and I think that you're absolutely we're hearing that. And you know, given my role at United Airlines, I have a perspective on what we've done well and what we've done poorly. And you know, it wouldn't be hard for you to find people in United Airlines who might say, "Hey, you guys, over time you haven't stepped up the way that you should." So what I applaud is our willingness to have those conversations now and to be completely transparent and to stop spinning the circumstances and own up to the fact that there are very few corporations across the landscape that have really, in a meaningful way, stood up and really made the investments necessary, focused on hiring, promoting and retaining talent across the board, in particular African-American talent at the highest levels in organizations. We all have a ways to go, but I think that when we have members of our teams who are willing to stand up and be honest and speak their piece and say, you as members of management need to be held accountable, and you need to step up and account for what we have and have not been able to do in our own organizations, then that's an important part of the process. And we have to be willing to stand up and say, you're absolutely right, and this is what we're going to do about it. Because our overall success here will have everything to do with not the initial statements that we've all made, but what our organizations look like, in the next 6, 12, 18 months from now. That will tell the tale.
and I would imagine how sustainable that look is going forward. Terry, which one is more important, do you think, to the average person of color in the corporate world? Empathy or action? Or
I
is
think
there a trade-off at all?
Yeah, for me, I'd say action. I tell people all the time, look, I don't care really what you think, but I do care about how what you think impacts, the lifeline of the individuals in the organization. Because I don't think we're going to change everybody's attitude about that. And I certainly think this last election is indicative of the fact that a lot of feelings and perspectives have not changed over the years. And there's still a great racial divide, and there's still a concern that any focus on advancing opportunities for minorities, particularly African Americans, comes at the expense of the other guys. And so, at this point, though, I think the companies are going to have to stand behind their words with what I call meaningful leap action. It can't just be, establish the diversity committee and have the discussions and review the goals and obligate. At some point, you're going to have to, do what I think one or two organizations have started to do, tie compensation to goals or objectives around diversity, around inclusion, around promotional opportunities, things of that nature. Look at the CEO's compensation and look at, what is the CEO success profile, and does it include focuses on criteria around changing the racial and makeup of the organization. I'm not one for quotas, but, at some point, making goals or objectives very definable and very clear seems to be the only way we're going to make some sort of progress in this area. We've been talking about these issues for so long. I just don't think the talk alone or hoping that people's hearts will change is really going to make a difference here. And I don't know, that may be my jaded HR legal view, but it's I sit on the board for a couple of organizations, and we're having these discussions at the board level now, which I do think is a good step. And you talk about what's sustainable. One of the things that we did do at one organization is we incorporated into the governance guidelines of the board a requirement that these issues be addressed and reviewed at the board level, not just as a result of this CEO's actions, but as a sustainable part of how the board conducts its business going forward. So there are some things that we can do to sort of incorporate into the infrastructure of the business a more defined and more specific review and accountability around these issues. But in the same discussion, we're talking about CEOs unwilling to set goals or just super advanced people or identify high potentials and fast track their careers, because there is now, even than before, more backlash from the non-minority employees. So I think the tension is even worse right now, and it's going to take a really meaningful leap in the actions in order for there to be a difference.
David, if I could just follow up on one of the things Terry said. She talked about, at the expense of others. And that's the dangerous part. People don't want to go there. But the reality is that we live in a world of competition, especially in the business sector. We're competing against our competitors in the marketplace. There's internal competition for opportunity and advancement. And so to the extent that we are willing to tolerate these disparities, we are shielding people from competition. And so it's not so much, well, zero-sum game. No, you are expected to compete against other people who are given comparable opportunity, and you're expected to produce and win to get promoted and advanced. And so we're just making sure that there's fair competition. And that conversation is one that people are reluctant to have. Yes, it is a zero-sum game to some degree. Of course, the organization's growing, so the pie's growing, but ultimately we're introducing more competition. In the same way that when we started to take full advantage of women in the country, we increased the level of competition. And that's what we've got to do here, and we can't be bashful about it.
Bret, have companies focused beyond their employees and beyond their customers to other marketplace and business relationships, be it their vendors, be it other participants in their ecosystems to the extent they could or should?
Well, the short answer is no. That is certainly happening. And there are some companies out there that, to their credit, are really good at it. They're good at identifying businesses, helping them develop, preparing them to engage and to be successful in their ecosystems, to borrow your term. And there are others who have not been terrific at it. I can tell you that we've been pretty good at it, but not as good as we're going to be, and not as good as we need to be. It is a really important part of connecting with our community, a really important part of economic development and economic opportunity. And again, it's just about leveling the playing field and creating opportunities. So it's a really, I'm glad you brought it up, it's a really important part of what companies have to do. It's one of the pillars for us moving forward in terms of making meaningful change and engagement. If you look at the spend that corporations, large and small, have, it's mind-boggling. You know, our supply chains, our procurement departments, that is where wealth creation opportunities exist. That is where the opportunities to create jobs in our communities exist. And it's an area that more and more we have to focus on, and we have the wherewithal to get that right.
I'm thinking about something that you just said, Clarence, and this notion, and I'm going to summarize it in a slightly different way than you said it, and that is we have the things that we focus on. I like to call them shiny things. As is typical with fast-moving, hard-charging, shareholder maximizing businesses, the second that they're no longer shiny, we go to something else. How do we make sure that this conversation and the actions, as Terry points out, that should come from it continue and don't become a shiny thing?
I think we have to embed it in the social systems of the organization at every level. And so talent management. And this isn't about a diversity officer. It's not about a program. It's not about, you know, adding a few HBCUs to recruit from. It really is about how we source people, how we orient people, how we engage in performance management, how we engage in progression management. And so at every stage, this has to be a thread of the conversation and the HR systems. And that means that it will be sustainable. It also means that we will make progress over time. It's very difficult in an area like this to really have some big, quick win. I mean, you can parachute in a Black leader at a senior level, and that's important. But ultimately, you've got to go back and really do the foundational work. The same thing in marketing. As we think about all the marketing disciplines, then we have to really make sure that we're looking at them through this lens, whether it's insights, you know, product development, marketing communications. And so it's got to be embedded in all those fundamental business disciplines that we use to run our organizations. And I would say, you know, to bring an optimistic piece to this, a lot of companies have done this foundational work, and they have made progress. They're not perfect. And to Bret's point, they will have employees, even these leadership companies, that feel like they're not getting it done. We had an organization at Darden, 200,000 employees, a Black CEO, Black general counsel, Black head of operations at one of the biggest brands. And I'm confident there were thousands of Black employees in that organization out of 200,000 that didn't think we were getting it done. But you have to really embed it in those foundational things that help you drive the business.
Culturally, Terry, that makes you vulnerable. From governance down through management, down through employee perception, down through third-party relationships, vendors, customers, otherwise, being as transparent as Clarence and Bret and you have been talking about makes the organization vulnerable. I imagine some management folks being pretty nervous about that. What advice would you give them?
You know, sure. I think we're on a call with a lot of lawyers, and I'm sure the lawyers are nervous about that too. I know, whenever, when I was at UPS and we pushed establishing, goals and looking a little harder because we weren't making the level of progress we wanted to, we had to share data in order to be able to do that. And there was always a concern that the data would be turned against us. But the CEO at the time basically said, look, if we're going to make meaningful effort here, we're going to have to take that risk because our goal is to do good. And we can't do good if we don't know the extent of the problem. And so we have to share the data. We have to be transparent with the data. And it was uncomfortable, and some people did not agree with it. But I think the ability to focus and to really have clear metrics for success made the difference. I mean, we were a metric-driven organization, and what gets measured is what gets done. And if we did not feel the same way about diversity and inclusion efforts, then nothing would be accomplished. So I do think it takes strong leadership and a willingness to take that risk, but with the right frame of mind and the right perspective. And I think to Clarence's point, the other thing I would say is in terms of embedding change within the organization, there's also a change of mindset in terms of what we want to do with our employees. So many times we bring in employees, particularly people we bring in from the outside, minority employees, and we stand them up and say, okay, we brought in these diverse candidates. Now we need to see if they're going to be successful. And for me, the mindset shift needs to be, how do we ensure that all of our minority candidates are successful? How do we ensure that we're giving them the opportunities for success, both those that we're bringing in new to the organization from outside, but also those that are within our own four walls and that we're developing within the organization. And I think companies have gotten away from this concept of ensuring the success of their employees. And maybe it's gone a little too much more to compete for your role. Everyone has to compete for their role and the best survive. So I think there has to be a mindset shift. I know when I used to talk to law firms, and there used to be a difference, when I shift from a law firm into a corporation, and corporations used to invest in their employees, and they were, it costs money to turn over employees. And so there was a significant focus on ensuring that we were getting the most out of our employees and developing them for success and not to lose them. But it seems like we've moved away from that. And I think a better emphasis on that, particularly with African-American employees, can really help keep them engaged within the organization and identify risk of losing if things are not going as they need to go.
Bret, a close to home question for you. United Airlines, iconic brand. Is this conversation and what you guys are doing brand enhancing for you?
Oh, I absolutely believe it is, without question. If you think about also about our organization, and pre-pandemic, we were close to 95,000 employees. And again, our people live in every community around all of our hubs and our smaller stations. And we like to believe that we are embedded in the fabric, not only of the United States, but around the world. And ideally, when you think about a brand like that, and you hope that your brand is iconic, and believe that United Airlines is, then people want to see and believe the best about that brand as well. And to be brand enhancing doesn't mean that it has to be something that everyone agrees with from day one either. It's about the overall contribution that you're making. And I think there's a real opportunity for leadership in this area, and for various companies to really step forward and go beyond what we talked about, which was the first stage of just talking about what we need to do, but actually proving it out. So I absolutely believe that. I know our CEO does. Look, the first thing he did at United Airlines was promote a Black man to be his president for the first time in the near 100-year history of our industry. So So I think we believe it 100%, and I certainly do.
So here we are, 2020. Hopefully it will be over soon. I think by the process of life and time, it will be over soon. I've seen the 1 star out of 5 icon way too many times for this year. Does this conversation make us as a society better off? And does businesses' participation in this make it better off? Terry talked about governance, and I think that's a really high level discussion in most organizations about the direction of the organization and what the organization purports to be for its shareholders. So I'm interested in your thoughts on where this conversation goes in 2021. Are we having the same one, or have we progressed enough that we can move to implementation, we can move towards, aggressive improvement? Where do you think we are in the life cycle of this conversation, Clarence?
I think we're early stages. So I think it will be a continuation of the conversation in 2021. So I think people just have to get their head around these inequities, begin to really peel the onion and understand how we came to be this way. So that whole notion of just becoming literate when it comes to the racial and social history of the organization, of the country rather, and of the various organizations that comprise it. And so I think that listening, that dialogue will continue. I think that's important for it to continue. I do think there are companies and other organizations outside the business world that have sort of been down the road a bit longer, and so they will move from conversation to additional action. Like they'll be refining the action plans that they've been engaged in for, in many cases, decades, and move the ball forward. But I think as an overall thing, we'll still be in conversation in 2021.
Terry?
I'm hopeful. I do think that there will those who will come out of this stronger and more committed to these issues. But I also think that when this is another shiny item for some companies, and when the shine wears off, they'll be back focused on other priorities. And that's unfortunate, because I do think that employees in organizations, if nothing else, they were encouraged by their companies making bold statements. Many of them were encouraged by the discussions that were taking place in the organization about these issues, but it definitely raised the bar for expectation in terms of change. And I think there will be some letdown if companies don't live up to the hyperbole of the discussion. So I think the good will be separated from the great, and the great will be separated from the rest.
Bret, a thought?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. My hope is that those companies that remain committed to this are really able to separate themselves. And I think we would all agree that being great at diversity, equity, and inclusion is a competitive advantage. And so I hope the very best for those companies that embrace it and push it harder. And as Clarence mentioned, and as Terry also focused on, who are taking the time to build it into their organizations at a foundational level. I hope they reap all the benefits from it. I hope that they're able to shine, and people recognize just what magnificent upside there is to having an organization that allows everyone to bring their best selves to work, and where people are reflected at all levels of the organization, and how much more successful the overall organization is. I hope that that's United Airlines, and I hope that others who do it really benefit from it. Then I think that we will also see others take a second look. The other thing I'll add is I hope there's accountability. There has to be accountability. So, for those who are writing the wonderful letters and making the statements, I hope that I hope across the board, our teammates and our employee bases pull those statements back out and hold us accountable for them. That is exactly what will need to happen.
So if you guys are anything like us, you have multiple generations of people in your organization, and by definition, some built-in diversity of thought, and by definition, some disagreement on most issues, because you're talking about baby boomers on one end and X's, Y's, and Z's on the other. Do you see this as an issue where there is a significant difference in point of view depending on when you were born and how you grew up? Or is this pretty universal? I don't know, Bret, if you have a view on that one way or the other.
I think there are different points of view. I mean, look at our country. You know, and I think our companies are microcosms of the country. And so I think there are really strong views on both ends. From a generational perspective, I think it varies as well. You know, I think the younger generations they're built a little differently, and for what I can see, they are much more focused on these issues, and they're willing to have the conversations up front, where folks of my generation are you know, a little more reserved. But we absolutely see strong feelings on all sides of this in our organization, and I would be stunned if that wasn't the case in other organizations of any size.
David, I do think I think place matters as much as generation. I think we've seen it in this election. So I do think the folks that really live in the metropolitan areas, regardless of where it is in the country, whether it's where I am in Orlando or Tampa or the Miami area or other states in their major metros, it's different there than it is in the rest of the country. Those differences are more distinct by place of residence, I think, to some degree than they are by generation. And I think the generational piece, there's some of that, but not as much as you'd think. And I think the voting patterns in this election demonstrated that.
Perfect. We're right at the point where we'll start taking some questions from the audience. I want to start with one more, if I could, though. Corporations like ours tend to have a bully pulpit on social issues. How involved should we be in the public policy discussion on things like voting rights and other issues that will have an impact on this going forward?
You know, it's interesting. In the past, I think a lot of that was driven by the CEO. So I'll be curious to hear Clarence and Bret's perspective, because if you had a CEO who was not afraid to be very vocal on social justice issues, on issues beyond those directly related to the corporation, it tended to, you know, filter through the organization. The organization could take on the perspective in some regards of that CEO. And we used to have a number of very active and opinionated CEOs. I do think it is still a caution for many organizations, because the employee base and the customer base is so disparate in their thinking on some of these issues that you intentionally likely to alienate some group. And so I think that while corporations want to be able to use that bully pulpit, they're going to be very careful in deciding on which issues they're going to weigh in on, because it's through social media and other methods. It's people will find out their positioning, and they're not afraid to take steps, whether to you know, be aggressive in attacking or cancel culture, as they say, the organization for their position, or in on the contrary, to support them. So you know, I do think that there is a role for the brave CEOs who are willing to do that. I do think it comes from a collective effort in the C-suite, but the CEO's got to be willing to stand behind those statements. And so I think it depends on how willing they are to take those issues on.
I think when you talk about the CEO role and sort of what the unique job responsibilities are, and one of those is clearly leading culture building and evolution of the organization. And most organizations are really focused on defining that culture, communicating the important pieces of it, purpose, values, mission internally, and being very transparent about that. And so at a minimum, to the extent that there is a public policy issue that really, sort of intersects with a key cultural precept that you're preaching every day, then you have to weigh in.
There's got to be that nexus for you,
or you're just going to fail at building the kind of culture you want to build. So you have to weigh in when there's that intersection. So I think for sure, every CEO needs to do that. Away from that, a lot of us felt public policy was important to the extent that it affected organizations directly. So we spent a lot of time with civic leaders, public policy makers, elected officials, you name it. But it's on a very narrow set of issues. What you're saying is, are we willing to go deeper and deal with the causes, that drive those public policy dynamics? And I think some will. The ones who really like that part of the job probably are willing to dig deeper. There are a lot of people that don't like that part of the job.
Yeah, no, I would agree completely. I think look, there are opportunities for all of us to engage at that level. It shouldn't be a shock to anyone where your company comes out and where your leaders come out on issues. And if it is, then it probably means that your organization and your leaders aren't engaged enough for people to understand sort of, as a company where you're centered. So I think it does a disservice to the organization if the leaders are commenting on just about everything that comes out, because you still have a job to lead the organization, but it should be abundantly clear where the organization stands, and it shouldn't be a shock when the leaders step forward and take a position on important issues, because it should be entirely consistent with the culture of the company.
We've got a phone call full of lawyers, so we did get a couple of questions that are specific to the corporate law firm relationship with regard to this topic. I know a couple of you have dealt with this before because I just know you, but I'm just going to throw out a hypothetical, and the hypothetical is a young associate on a team from a law firm is involved in working on your account and doesn't feel that he or she is getting the appropriate level of credit that they should get because of who they are or because of what they look like, or in this case, because they're Black. What is the corporate client's role in dealing with that issue? Some folks would say that that's appropriate for the law firm to deal with, and I, as the hirer of the law firm, need to stay out of that. Others would say that team represents me, and therefore it should represent me. Would be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, for me, it's a situation when I was general counsel I dealt with, and in that instance, we actually had an associate or a young partner who was did the majority of the work on the case, but they weren't the relationship partner in the case. And it became very evident that they were not getting credit for the relationship. And I had to go and speak with the firm and say, look, if you are interested in continuing the representation, then we need to have a change in who the relationship partner is or who the primary contact is, because this individual is doing all the work and they're not getting the credit for it. And yes, that person told me later that it did create hiccups within the firm, but it also created opportunities because the firm was committed to keeping the company as a client. So I do think that If you have clear expectations set for the law firms about representation, about who represents you on cases, then and the way in which they should be credited, apart from the clear partnership and compensation rules of the firm, you have an obligation to speak up and to talk with the firm about that. And I've done that repeatedly. We've changed firms because that didn't happen. We've talked about why certain associates left when they were working on our matters, and sometimes the answers were good and sometimes they were not. But we regularly had conversations with the law firms about what they were doing to ensure that there was a diverse group of attorneys representing our matters.
Yeah, I agree completely. We actually required our major firms, either the relationship partner had to be diverse, or there had to be 2 relationship partners, and one of the 2 had to be diverse. And so we were very forward-leaning in our expectations in terms of the team members and engagement, and it worked out and has continued to work out well for us. But we didn't hesitate to change relationship partners, or to change relationships between firms if we weren't happy with that. So I think general counsels are uniquely positioned to do that. And the legal profession, it has been up and down. Law firms have made some progress, and then we hit a difficult patch, and all of a sudden it gets wiped out, and there's an acceptable explanation for it, because the economy has gone sideways or some other rationale. But I think it still requires a fair amount of vigilance, and I think general counsels are uniquely positioned to be very clear about their expectations in this area, and are then required to follow through on it.
Terry earlier mentioned metrics. What do you keep track of in order to measure progress, to measure success in this circumstance? Clarence,
Yeah,
how you lived your life, so.
I think there are a number of different things. So certainly the first thing you keep track of is representation. So what are the numbers at every level of the organization, within every discipline? And do we have representation at every level? If not, do we have adequate representation in the feeder pool to the level where we're lacking? If we don't have that, we're nowhere. And so what are we going to do to change that dynamic? That's part of it. The other part is to try to understand whether people are thriving or not. So part of that is about employee engagement and measuring employee engagement and seeing, are there negative disparities in employee engagement on various dimensions when it comes to Black employees, or women, or young, but you focus on Black employees. The other is when you talk about, in our case, measuring the customer experience, and are there disparities, in those measurements? Are they negative? Sometimes they're positive, and your Black customers feel better about you than they do others. And there are all kinds of reasons why that might be the case. But it really is about just the numbers, and then how people are doing in terms of being promoted and how they feel about their situation. And so all of those go into it. And I would agree with Terry that you really need to have goals around your numbers. You need to have goals around eliminating disparities, and people's compensation, or variable compensation, ought to be based on progress or regress against those targets. And you ought to have goals about customer acquisition. And this is an opportunity. Where are these customers when it comes to participation in our industry? How do I stack up to my competitors? Am I getting more of them or fewer of them? I mean, that's one way to build sales.
We've got about 4 minutes left, so I want to end on what I would hope would be a high note. Despite everything we've talked about, I know that there is a palpable sense of hope and pride about what we are seeing, given all of the struggles that people of color are going through right now. At least I feel that way, and I assume that you guys do as well. We've talked about, from a metric perspective, what success would look like. What's your hope for organizations like ours, for corporates going forward? What is it that you would really, really love to see? Bret, let me start with you.
It would be great if we could, so I personally have never served on an executive team at a true executive team leading a corporation with another African American. And so, I would like to get to a point where it's just common. And, where we're not counting the number of CEOs like Clarence on one hand, and that we see that, at various levels in organizations, and organizations that are healthy enough that they are both bringing in talent and developing that talent and promoting that talent throughout, so that we have a healthy ecosystem that ensures that if people want to sit in these roles, that they have a chance to do it. It's a great pleasure for me to be on a panel with Clarence and Terry. I mean, I've Googled them a dozen times over the course of my careers and followed what they've done. And Terry being in a similar industry, I've seen every one of her moves and have studied them, and it's been inspirational. And Clarence, you as well. But it would be fabulous not to have to hop on Google to find that, and to have it within, and for all of our folks to have that in the organizations in which they're developing and building their careers. So that would be my hope. But since this may be the last time I get to speak, I just do want to say what a real pleasure it's been to be on this panel with all of you, and Terry and Clarence. I've followed your careers, and it's a pleasure. And David, a pleasure as well.
Thank you, Bret. Appreciate it. Terry?
I agree with Bret on a lot. I think for me, it's that frozen middle in the organization. I do think that we're going to see meaningful movement at the top of the house. I think, what we're seeing now at record levels, African Americans getting placed on boards, being considered for senior level opportunities. I think hopefully we'll see more in the CEO seat over the next few years. And I think entry level, we're doing a better job of recruiting a diverse workforce. But that frozen middle is still the really hard nut to crack. And unfortunately, if we can't seem to change that mid-management group and to help them understand that by creating opportunities for African Americans, for diverse people, they're not limiting their own opportunities. To Clarence's point earlier, it's really around making the corporation better by making sure that we have the right talent in the right role. But I think if we don't fix and they try to get some change in that frozen middle, we're going to lose all the efforts that we have at the bottom of the house, and we're just going to keep circulating, a few at the top of the house, and we won't actually get change throughout the organization. So my hope would be if we could somehow follow that middle ground, that middle management team, to help them understand that opportunities for African Americans is really opportunities for everyone.
Excellent, Terry. Thank you. Clarence?
I would like to hope that we can put ourselves in a position where we're once again setting the pace when it comes to these issues. If I look back, I'm a historian. Companies, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Xerox, IBM, they were setting the pace. when it came to including African Americans at a point where segregation was still rampant in the country in the 50s and 60s. They really were leaders. And if you look today, you know, my view is that the selective colleges and universities set the pace. I mean, the Ivy League schools all, for the most part, are more than double digit in percentage of African American students, Black students, 10, 11, 12, sometimes 13%. Much higher than the pools that they're selecting from. A lot of the schools, the selective schools that feed them, the selective boarding schools, Phillips Exeter, Andover, Lawrenceville, are even higher than that. And so they are truly setting the pace. And I would hope that that's where the business world is, because that's where we were before. And we were way ahead of those selective schools if you go back and look at the 50s in the case of PepsiCo, and then into the 60s with IBM and Xerox. And so what does it take for us to once again set the pace and show the larger society, which doesn't have the element of command and control that we have? And we're not fully command and control organizations, but we're more command and control than the state of California or the state of New York or the state of Mississippi is. And so we ought to be really showing the way. That's what I'd hope to see.
Clarence, Terry, Bret, thank you very much. I'd like to finish up with what my hope would be. And for me, very simply, I'd like to see us create environments where people of color, no matter what level they are in the organization, can thrive. And thrive is a scientifically amorphous word. It's sort of, you know it when you see it. And that's the difficulty here. But I would love to see an environment where every single employee who wants to have a thriving relationship with our organizations has the ability to do so and the opportunity to do so. And with that, I'd like to tell our audience, thank you very much. Eve, I don't know if you want to come in and welcome our audience and thank our audience, excuse me.
Well, first, I'd like to thank all of you, Terry, Bret, Clarence, David. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for sharing your insights and your perspectives. It was a fantastic conversation, and I appreciate just being able to be a fly on the wall. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of our sponsors. Thank you to our participants. I hope you have a fantastic week and a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.